Planet Earth is 4,500 million years old. To try to understand this astronomical time span, we can compare the life of the planet to the life of a 45-year-old woman whom we will call Gaia. While very little is known about Gaia's early childhood, we do know that when she was 7, her flowing molten lava begins to cool down, and as a crust develops, rocks begin to form. By Gaia's 8th birthday, microscopic life has emerged, and by the time she's 15, photosynthesis has developed in the seas. Over the next 10 years, complex cells start evolving, and by the time she's 25, multicellular life has appeared. When she's 39, primitive life forms and insects emerge, and around her 40th birthday, fish begin to populate the great oceans, while on the land, plants appear. In her early 40s, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds come into being, and in the spring of her 44th year, she blossoms and flowers. Just days before her 45th birthday, prehistoric humans, our ancestors, appear. And over the next week, these new arrivals discover fire, weapons, and tools. Less than an hour ago, we learn how to grow crops and domesticate animals, and farming is born. About 30 minutes ago, we begin making bronze weapons, and we also discover the wheel. Stonehenge is built just 26 minutes ago, and during the next 4 minutes, sophisticated human civilizations begin to emerge. The Buddha is born in India 13 minutes ago, and in Greece, a minute later, Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, is born. 10 minutes ago, Christianity emerges, and then, 2.5 minutes later, Islam. Gunpowder reaches the West just over 4 minutes ago, and 1.5 minutes later, Europeans arrive in the New World to begin their conquest and colonization of the Americas. 1 minute ago, as scientist Edward Jenner discovers vaccines, the Industrial Revolution begins, and our relationship with the Earth changes forever. "57 seconds ago, as the human population exceeds 1 billion, electricity, railways, and cars are invented. And 30 seconds later, as we take to the sky for the first time, we discover film. And shortly afterwards, the age of television arrives. 33 seconds ago, the First World War erupts, claiming 10 million lives. followed a few seconds later by the Second World War, when 60 million people died. And 22 seconds ago, in 1945, the nuclear age is spawned. Ten seconds ago, our remarkable ingenuity allows us for the first time since our arising to leave Gaia and head for the heavens. And, making our first tentative steps into space, we're astonished by what we find.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Suddenly there emerged a sparkling blue and white jewel, a delicate sphere laced with swirling veils of white, a small pearl in a thick sea of black mystery. A planetary being that looked so fragile that if you touched it, it would fall apart. It takes more than a moment to fully realize that this is Earth, home. Sometimes, looking out of my spacecraft, I get the feeling that planet Earth is breathing. I wasn't brought up to think of the world as a living being. Such an impression comes to me only in this new outer perspective of space, which so provokes the thought that I can't help wonder upon it. Could it just be that the Earth is alive?
While images of Earth from space reveal an intrinsically beautiful planet, they also reveal one that is badly damaged. And 3 seconds ago, as the human population reaches 6 billion, scientists chillingly warn that while Gaia will undoubtedly survive in one form or another, the question is, will we?
Gaia is no doting mother, tolerant of our wrongdoings, nor is she some delicate damsel in danger from brutal mankind. She is stern and tough, always keeping the earth comfortable for those who obey the rules, but ruthless in her destruction of those who misbehave.
Some of us get all sentimental and think of Gaia as a goddess creature who resembles everybody's mom in that she knows what's best for us. But if you look at the historical record, Mount Vesuvius, Krakatoa, the San Francisco earthquake, Hurricane Katrina, and so on, down the ages, you have to ask yourself the question, whose side is she on?
Since the Industrial Revolution, in this last minute of Gaia's life, we've changed our atmosphere, our land surfaces, and our habitats more than they changed previously in millions of years. And although our meteoric rise to ascendancy has been breathtaking, in the process we've presided over the extinction of countless thousands of species of plants and animals.
If there were ever a parliament of creatures in this disintegrating phase of our industrial civilization, its first decision might well be to vote the human species out of the community as an affliction of the world, its demonic presence too deadly to tolerate any further.
We've come a long way since first stepping out of the forests a few days ago, and in a sense we've come full circle in once again rediscovering our dependence on the living processes of the natural world. With the growth of industrial civilization, this was largely forgotten, but now, as these last few seconds of biological time slip away, and as global temperatures rise and polar ice caps melt, we're obliged to remember that Gaia is greater than us, committed to her own survival. And anything that threatens that survival will be ruthlessly destroyed in the interests of a higher value, life itself. Wrapped around the Earth is a fragile membrane of organisms, so complex and so intricate that most species composing it remain undiscovered. We owe everything to this membrane of life: the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, the water that we use, the firewood we collect, the materials that help us build our homes and pursue our medicine. A membrane that contains within itself hidden biological secrets and mysteries that maybe one day could advance our sciences more than we can begin to imagine from species we haven't yet even identified. We don't know how many plants and animals exist on the planet, and although biologists have discovered 1.5 million different species, there are still tens of millions more unknown. And even before we discover them, more are disappearing today than at any time in the last 65 million years. Possibly dozens of species being erased every single day in an explosive and haunting tale of accelerating biocide. Scientists know of at least 40,000 species threatened with extinction today, and warn that half of the planet's existing species could be gone in 100 years' time. Entire genetic legacies born in the beginnings of life on Earth, but removed from the future. A fate that's already befallen countless mammals, amphibians, fishes, insects, birds, and plants. The extinction of any living thing doesn't just affect the deceased species itself, but also impacts upon the communities to which it belongs. An interconnected web of organic life in which the loss of the tiniest species changes everything forever, just as the loss of a loved one changes a family forever.
We need another and a wiser, more mystical concept of other creatures. Remote from nature, human civilization surveys animals through a glass that sees everything distortedly. We patronize animals for their incompleteness and their tragic fate in having taken form so far below ourselves, but therein lies our error. For animals shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and perfected, gifted with the extension of the senses that we've lost or never attained, living by voices we'll never hear. They aren't our brothers, nor are they inferior underlings. They are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and suffering of the earth.
Today's biological catastrophe has many causes, but only one culprit. The creature that considers itself the steward of creation, but a creature that's become its slayer and slaughterer. Over the last 50 years, as biodiversity has significantly decreased, the number of creatures on Earth has doubled. 2 chickens now exist on Earth for every human being, while the pig population has trebled to 2 billion. However, far from living natural lives, these creatures are forced to live in vast industrial units, crushed together under artificial light and force-fed antibiotics and growth hormones. In producing a plentiful and cheap supply of meat for the exploding human population, industrialized farming techniques have radically altered our diets, and today we're far more carnivorous than ever before, consuming in countries like China 13 times more meat than we did 40 years ago. But such developments come at a price. In satisfying our insatiable appetites for cheap roasts, cheap mince, and fried chicken, we've sometimes fed creatures designed by nature never to eat meat the rendered remains of dead pigs, dead sheep, dead cows, and dead poultry, and in some cases dead horses and dead dogs too. And in so doing, we've heightened the risk of potentially lethal viruses being transmitted from the animal kingdom to human beings. As well as the environmental damage caused by pouring millions of tons of the toxic effluent of these creatures into local ecosystems, scientists are increasingly concerned that factory farms are causing genetic erosion and weakened immunity among their inmates, and in so doing becoming vast, industrialized incubators of viral mutations, viruses capable of being unleashed upon the human population.
What has become clear is that if we burn all the fossil fuels and put that carbon back in the atmosphere, we will send the Earth back to a state that it hasn't been in millions of years, long before humans walked on the planet.
According to the scientific community, unless global carbon emissions are significantly reduced by 2020, an environmental cataclysm of apocalyptic proportions will be unleashed upon the poorest peoples of the world, and our greenhouse gas emissions will herald biological and sociological catastrophe, loss of crops, diminished water supplies, widespread famine, rampant disease, social unrest, political instability, and, increasingly, violent conflicts and wars fought over fast dwindling and scarce resources. A nightmare scenario not only for the poorest and most vulnerable people on the planet, but also a nightmare scenario for the rest of us in the wealthier world too, as we're faced with tens of millions of desperate climate refugees.
Climate change poses complex obstacles to global peace, global security, and the equal distribution of global goods. Protecting people living in poverty from the spiraling destruction of climate change and ensuring their ability to develop out of poverty is first and foremost a moral and humanitarian obligation, but it's also a political necessity.
Today, the divide between the world's rich and the world's poor has never been greater, and an average Briton annually emits 23 times more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than an average African. 10 times more than an average Indian, and 3 times more than a person in China, while an American annually emits 50 times more carbon dioxide than an African, 20 times more than an Indian, and 6 times more than an average person in China. That as it's we in the wealthy countries who benefited most from a carbon-based economy, it's we who bear the greatest moral responsibility to tackle climate change. And, inevitably, on a planet where the giant web of life stretches from continent to continent, unless we seriously look for alternative ways of creating energy, there'll be no escape for any of us, as the devastating consequence of climate change will ultimately impact on us all.
While it's too late to prevent some impacts of climate change, it's not too late to prevent catastrophe. The action required to cut carbon emissions will require radical changes in economies and lifestyles in wealthy countries like Britain and the United States. As well as being a challenge, this is an opportunity for us to move away from high levels of consumption towards living more sustainable and healthier lives in harmony with the environment we depend upon and with the poor we currently exploit.
We find ourselves ethically destitute just when for the first time in planetary history we're faced with ultimacy, the irreversible closing down of Earth's functioning in its major life systems. Our ethical traditions know how to deal with suicide, homicide, and even genocide, but these traditions collapse entirely when confronted with biocide, geocide, and ecocide.
We've done our best to fulfill the injunction to subdue the earth. But, confronted by the powerful and overwhelming forces of nature, our struggle for dominion has been long and hard, a struggle that continues to this day. Over time, as we increasingly manage to control and master some aspects of the world, our destructive effect on the environment wasn't hugely significant, and the vast majority of the human population lived in comparative accord with the natural world. But all this changed about 400 years ago. In the 16th and 17th centuries, a belief system emerged that had as its aim and avowed intent the complete human domination and mastery over nature. Known as the scientific method, this prevailing worldview maintained that only human beings have intrinsic value, and everything else, plants, animals, and minerals, only have value so long as they might benefit humanity. A human-centered and anthropocentric view of the natural world, epitomized by the work of Francis Bacon, an influential English philosopher known as the father of modern science.
Since everything in nature is under man's use, man is at liberty to modify it and mold it to the enlarging dominion of his empire. Our aim is to establish the power and dominion of the human race over nature, to force, enslave, constrain, penetrate, dissect, and bind her into service.
"200 years after the rise of Bacon's scientific method, a series of ingenious technological inventions sent Europe hurtling into an age of industrialization, initiating what was to become the most revolutionary shift in human attitudes and human behavior towards the natural world since the invention of agriculture 10,000 years earlier. A revolution so profound that it transformed not only the human world forever, but also the non-human world too. Driven by a technological system unlike anything that had gone before, the overriding goals of the Industrial Revolution were human progress at all costs, and economic growth, whereby products were increasingly designed to become rapidly obsolete, thus making room for more production, while a rising population were encouraged to consume more to keep the whole process going. Industrial civilization brought with it new and exciting technological advances and increasingly ingenious and productive ways of harnessing energy, advancing agriculture, and improving medicine. However, this new world order also brought with it an almost universal perception of the natural world as an inert, lifeless machine, existing solely for human use and for human domination. A belief system that has so permeated scientific, technological, and cultural thinking for the last 200 years that scarcely a corner of the planet or a creature living on it has remained untouched. During the 1960s, a generation arose that challenged conventional attitudes to a whole range of personal, social, and global issues. And, alongside popular movements seeking peace, justice, and equal rights, a movement emerged that was concerned about the causes and the consequences of our attitudes and our practices towards the natural world. And the environmental or green movement was born. Nowhere was this movement more powerful than in the United States of America, where, in 1967, at the University of California, a professor of history published a controversial article in a leading science magazine arguing that the blame for the emerging ecological crisis could be laid squarely at the door of the Christian religion.
Christianity, by insisting it is God's will that we exploit nature for his ends because nothing in creation has any purpose except to serve human purposes, is the most human-centered, anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. We shall continue to have a worsening environmental crisis until we reject the Christian idea that nature has no reason for existence save to serve humanity.
Institutionalized Christianity as the dominant cultural and political force in Western civilization for the past 2,000 years had, according to Professor White, been complicit in creating environmental havoc. Its arrival on the world scene wrecking, once and for all, ancient belief systems that for thousands of years had venerated and protected the natural world.
Every tree, every spring, and every stream had its own guardian spirit, and before one cut a tree or dammed a brook, one placated the spirit in charge of that particular situation. By destroying these belief systems, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects.
When we dig roots, we make little holes. We shake down pine nuts, we don't chop down trees. But you plow up the ground, blast rocks, pull down the trees, and kill everything. How can the spirit of the earth like you? Everywhere you touch, the earth is sore.
Unlike the Europeans' compulsion to conquer and consume, the Indians viewed the natural world not as a collection of isolated objects existing solely for human gain, but as a network and an intricate web of phenomena fundamentally interrelated and interdependent.
We are of the soil, the forests and the plains. We grow as naturally as the wildflowers and belong as the hawks belong. We fit into the air, the landscape and the seas. For the hand that fashioned them also fashioned us. Every bird, every humming insect, every sandy shore, and every shining pine needle is sacred and holy to my people. All things are connected. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. This we know.
The belief that the natural world existed entirely for human exploitation didn't suddenly appear overnight with the emergence of Christian civilization. 40,000 years before the arrival of Christianity, hunters and gatherers set fire to countless square miles of forests as an easy way of hunting. And 2,000 years before Christianity, the Sumerian civilization of southern Iraq collapsed as agricultural output fell because of deforestation and soil erosion. And 2,000 years later, parts of North Africa were turned to deserts after the intensive farming of grain. And in Europe, as the mighty Roman army conquered a continent, tens of thousands of acres of forests were cut down. For a species that considers itself as the crowning glory of creation, possessing a God-given right to rule over the natural world, the behaviour of Homo sapiens over recent centuries hasn't been all that intelligent. And by bulldozing and burning forests, by emitting lethal carbons and dangerous doses of radiation into the atmosphere, by spraying poisons on the land, by shattering mountains with nuclear bombs, and by polluting streams, rivers and oceans, the Genesis injunction to have dominion over nature has been mercilessly misinterpreted and carelessly confused with an injunction to dominate at all costs.
A billion Homo sapiens are added every 11 years to the planet. The absolute domination of a single species pushes other life forms out of bed and into extinction. The horrifying loss of biological diversity is the result of one life form annihilating other life forms in its immoral confusion of dominion with domination.
My Lord, he said unto me, do you like my garden so free? You may live in this garden if you keep the people free, and I'll